Without further ado, I want to welcome Rabbi Abraham Twersky.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. Actually, for me to come back to Colorado is a return to my old haunting grounds. As you know, my oldest brother, Rabbi Zalman Twersky, was rabbi in Denver for many years. And like some from 1947 through perhaps 1960, I used to come quite frequently to Denver. Somehow or other, I never made it up to Boulder. Right? So I'm certainly glad to be here today. I'd like to share with you just a few ideas, and then do with what you like. I don't have any aspirations anymore of turning the world around, or turning the state of Pennsylvania around, or turning the state of New York around, or Colorado for that matter. But I think that perhaps there are things that we can do within the confines of our own families, our own homes, to avert some of the tragic effects that are going on with our youth today. Now, you may or may not know that my subspecialty in psychiatry has been addiction, particularly alcoholism and drug addiction. And that's brought me into contact with a lot of young people who have been caught in the trap of drugs and are coming for help. And I see this, what has turned out to be rather an epidemic among young people, as maybe being symptomatic of the culture as a whole. In fact, when research is being done, sociologists, psychologists, on what are the factors within the environment of youngsters that contribute their going into chemical dependence, I say, they're doing an incomplete survey. What they ought to do is study more the families where youngsters are not on drugs, the environments where youngsters are not on drugs, and find out what's keeping them from it. Because what's happened is that our adult population is such that what the young people are doing are simply emulating the adults. I'll tell you what I mean by that. It's not ancient history, or maybe it is ancient history, my childhood. I remember when I was a kid, it's in the 1930s. That life was pretty miserable that time. It was before the era of antibiotics. And I don't know if you can imagine this, that it's only 60 plus years ago that the average life expectancy in the United States was 40. It was brought down precipitously by the number of infantile deaths, childhood diseases. Wasn't fun growing up as a kid then. My home was quarantined every time I had a contagious disease. So our home was quarantined for measles, for chickenpox, for whooping cough, for scarlet fever, for mumps. I had them all. You know what it was like when we had a hot day with a torrid temperature of 98 degrees and high humidity? You know what we did? We sweat bullets. How much relief could you get from an electric fan? Communication. Well, my trip to Denver, that was already in advanced, when I took the city of Denver, and it took 18 hours from Chicago to Denver. But I remember taking a trip from Milwaukee to Los Angeles on the transcontinental. There was 60 hours. Would you believe it that today, after 2 hours on the plane, I was getting impatient? So what's happened in communication, I remember when Dick Tracy's two-way radio was a fantasy. Right? And now, not only through radios, but Blackberries and whatever else they got, and I'm not familiar with the technology of it, but communication was difficult. And the work situation was miserable. And I think that if you would have told somebody in 1930 as to what life is going to be like in the year 2007, they wouldn't have believed you. Take a look at the city of Denver. When I came to the city of Denver, the leading industry was tuberculosis. Right? There isn't a single tuberculosis sanitarium in the United States. Who would have ever thought that possible? Antibiotics saving lives, replacing livers, replacing hearts, air conditioning, sitting in the comfort of your home and with a remote watching the television and watching a football game that's going on 3,000 miles away. And workplaces, workplaces today would have been thought of as being spas in 1930. Much of the work being done by electronics. What I'm getting at is this. When I was a kid, there was no way that anybody could have the thought that what life is about is to have pleasure. The goal of life is to maximize the pleasure in life that you can get. Nobody could have thought that. There was far too much discomfort, far too much distress for anyone to think that that's the thing could be possible. But now, thanks to technology, thanks to science, and thanks to medicine, so many of the sources of distress and misery have been relieved that we today can think that, you know something, you know what life is all about? Pleasure and having fun. Now, there's nothing wrong with pleasure, there's nothing wrong with having fun. I enjoy fun, and I enjoy pleasure, and I put chocolate syrup on my vanilla ice cream because I want to enjoy it more. So I am certainly not a killjoy. But I think that it is a mistake that has happened to our young people who have come to think that the goal of life is pleasure. And therefore, if the goal of life is pleasure, it makes no sense at all to experience displeasure for what? For a goal of life of pleasure. It reminds me about the guy who came by and he saw a guy sitting at the river's edge fishing. He says, "Young man, why aren't you working?" He says, "Why should I work?" He says, "Well, you know, so I should earn money." He says, "So why should I earn money?" "Well, so though one day you'll be able to retire in comfort." He says, "All right, and what'll I do then?" He said, "Well, you'll have plenty of time to go fishing." He says, "That's what I'm doing now." There is no point, if the goal of life is pleasure, of going through any kind of displeasure for the goal of pleasure. Okay? And I think that's what our young people are into. That the goal of life is pleasure. And anytime anything comes along that is in any way distressing, then that is taking away from the goal of life. And so you find immediate, not only pleasure, but immediate pleasure. And that's another thing that's happening. Technology has given us a ethos of immediacy and no delay, no tolerance of delay. My wife can tell you that because I just got a new computer. Right? And so I gave her my old computer. Right? And sometimes if I'd sit and work on her computer, I'd go berserk because it takes 45 seconds for the darn thing to work. Right? And I couldn't tolerate that. I had to have mine go on like that. We've lost our ability to tolerate delay. My dear friend, the late Charles Schultz, was an intuitive psychologist and said so many wonderful things in his cartoon strips. I met with him a couple of days before he died, and I showed him his cartoon strip, and I said, "Sparky, you realize what you've said here? I said, what? I said, you've taken the whole philosophy of this generation, you put it into 4 little frames of a comic strip. He says, what do you mean? So I showed him a strip that he wrote, where Sally wakes up Charlie Brown and she says, wake up, big brother. Charlie Brown sits up and says, wake up? What for? She says, so you can get an early start. Charlie Brown says, I'm not going anywhere. She says, that's too bad, you could have been the first one there. I said, don't you realize what you're saying here in this comic strip? Right? Speed is a value, regardless of whether you have a destination or not. Regardless of whether you have a purpose, regardless of whether you have a goal, as long as you do it fast, it's good. Now, you take those two things together. A goal of life is to have pleasure, and also not to delay it, but to have it immediately. And you can ask then, why aren't more kids using drugs? That's what it's all about. So, what is the solution to it? Well, our government has had a solution of sniffing dogs at the airports, and guards at the borders, and paying people, farmers, not to grow poppies and coca leaves. And they spent billions of dollars on prevention of drugs. It has accomplished nothing at all. The drug epidemic is as vibrant as ever. And I don't think that we can cure it by any of these methods. Obviously, the only way to bring this under control is that the consumer should not want the product. And for the consumer to not want the product, we have to establish an environment within the family, within our community, to whatever extent we can, that the goal of life is something else other than pleasure. Now, whether one does it with religion or whether it does it with something else, at this point it doesn't matter. Right? It's not what the goal of life is. It's not what the goal of life is not, rather than what the goal of life is. The goal of life is not maximizing fun and pleasure. And I think that because of that, I think we have to take another look at what spirituality is all about. Because, and maybe we'll get into this later this evening, that the human body is a composite creature. We are a body, a physical body, but clearly our physical body is an animal body. And what makes us unique is not only sapience, not only that we have greater intellect, because if that were true, then the finest person in the world is the most intelligent. And that's simply not true. You know, the most advanced intellectual country, academic country prior to World War II was Germany. So, intellect itself is not the hallmark of humanity. There are many other things that are unique to humankind, and that is the ability to look for a purpose in life. No animal can do that. The ability to improve oneself, to become a better person. I don't believe in the history of the world that any cow in the pasture has ever thought, what do I have to do to become a better cow than I am? The ability to delay gratification. The ability to give of oneself for the welfare of another person, a stranger. The ability to be free to make moral and ethical decisions in defiance of bodily drives. The ability to forgive. The ability to empathize. These are all unique human qualities. The ability to be master over oneself, to control one's anger, to control one's envy. These are all human characteristics that are not found in any other living things. And what I like to do is I like to take all of these features, all of these traits, and put them together and say the sum total of all of these unique traits is what I refer to as the human spirit. And so, are you talking about the neshama, the soul? I said, no, that is a religious concept, and I'm talking about a psychological concept. I'm talking about the abilities that human beings have that give them the uniqueness and dignity of being human. And inasmuch as all of these traits are abilities, which we may implement and exercise or not, if we exercise and implement them, then we are implementing the Spirit and we are being spiritual people. So what is spirituality? Spirituality is nothing other than being the finest human being that one can be. It can be done, but our culture is not great on it. And I think that what we can do within our own confines, whether it's family or community, is to try and do something to restore the concept of spirituality. That we are to have a goal of becoming the finest people that we can. Now, along the way, if you want to put chocolate syrup on your vanilla ice cream, that's fine. Along the way, if you want to have fun, that's great. But not to make those a goal in life. So these are some ideas that came out of my working with this population. And again, I thought I would just share that with you because I do think that it gives us an obligation and it gives us a responsibility as individuals, as heads of families, as members of families, and as members of the community, okay, to try to restore true spirituality to human life. Thank you for listening.
The topic tonight always reminds me a little bit of a Abbott and Costello routine. If I'm not for myself, what, you know, and if you're not for me, and, you know, if not now, when, and it's really a lovely conundrum, and there's, it's going to be a really delight tonight to see how we unravel that who's on first kind of question about the tension between ourselves as individuals and our role in the community. Rabbi Abraham Twersky, as many of you know, is not only a medical doctor and psychiatrist, but also a rabbi. And he has written so many books that when I printed this out, it was almost overwhelming. And I just wanted to read you a couple of titles because they're so wonderful, including a cookbook, Taste of Nostalgia. Angels Don't Leave Footprints, Dear Rabbi, Dear Doctor, Dearer Than Life, Making Your Life More Meaningful, Getting Up When You're Down, Growing Each Day, I Am I, It's Not As Tough As You Think, Light at the End of the Tunnel, Lights Along the Way, Living Each Day, Living Each Week, Living Each Moment is another Abbott stuff. Positive Parenting, Rebbe's in Hasidism, What They Said and What They Meant. That was very good. Self-improvement on Jewish, Overcoming Self-Defeating Behavior. Simcha, It's Not Just Happiness. Smiling Each Day, Successful Relationships at Home, at Work, and with Friends. 10 Steps to Being Your Best. The Enemy Within, The First Year of Marriage. Twersky on Prayer, Twersky on Spirituality, Visions of the Fathers, Wisdom Each Day. It's just really very, very humbling to be sitting next to such a prolific and wise author. As many of you also know, he is the founder of the Gateway Rehabilitation Center in Pittsburgh, and he is the son of the late Horner-Steipler Rebbe of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And my favorite aspect of him is that he has written a book with Snoopy characters drawn by Charles Schulz, which explains human interaction and behavior. And it comes from a very well-known family. His brother, Professor Rabbi Adam Twersky, Esquire, and I'd love to know how you're a rabbi and an Esquire. I'd like to find that out. Is a dean at Hofstra University and an attorney representing class action plaintiffs in the automobile industry. His older brothers are Grand Rabbi Michael Twersky, the Hornsteipler Rebbe of Milwaukee, the late Grand Rabbi Shlomi Twersky of blessed memory, the previous Hornsteipler Rebbe of Denver, and the late Rabbi Mordechai Dov Ber Twersky of New York. And he is really one of our generation's most eminent interpreters of the Torah's teachings regarding self-control and self-improvement. And I'm sure we'll be hearing more about that tonight. And on my left, Bruce Tift, who has been a practitioner of Vajrayana. Is that how you pronounce it? Vajra. Okay. If I can say Hornsteipler, we will find out both what that is and what Vajrayana Buddhism is tonight, I'm sure. And he's been doing this for more than 30 years. He was a student of from Trungpa Rinpoche. He has had the private psychotherapy practice since 1979. And I want you to know that there are people in this room that would be more Meshuggah if they hadn't been patients of Bruce Tift. I have that on very good authority. And he's also worked as a family therapist for social services for 7 years and taught at Naropa for 24 years and given trainings in the U.S. and abroad and lives right here in Boulder. So we are going to open up the conversation. I believe Rabbi Twersky will speak first, and then Bruce Tift will speak, and we'll engage in some dialogue, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Thank you.
Rabbi.
Thank you, Catherine. Hi. Good evening, everyone. I've stopped preparing for talks because I feel that if I prepare for them, they sound canned. So whenever I come to any kind of lecture, I trust that Hashem is going to give me the right thing to say. Rabbi Goldfeder chose to open with the nigun, with the words, Oda Hashem b'chol levav. I will be grateful, I will thank God with all of my heart. And I can't start off with that, but I'm going to come back to that because I do think that that is a great deal of what I want to say about the theme tonight. But what I was told about the theme tonight is the verse that is ascribed to Hillel, the great sage Hillel, En ani li mili, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? Shani latzmi ma'ani, and if I am for myself, then what am I? Brings to mind something that one of my ancestors, who was the Rebbe of Ropshut, said. He said, before I was born, my neshama, my soul, was up in heaven, and I looked around and I saw the inscription on one wall that said, Ma'od ma'od havish fal ruach, be very, very humble. And then I looked on the other wall and there was an inscription that said, Chayav adaloma, a person is obligated to say, Bishvili nivra ha'olam, the world was created for me. He said, now, that conflicts. I mean, if he's supposed to be very humble, how can he say the world is created for me? And he said, and I kept trying to reconcile the two, and all of a sudden I hear them say, Mazel Tov, boy is born. So I entered the world without having resolved it. And he said, throughout my lifetime, I still have not resolved it. There's another statement by Hillel, which is also interesting, and that is that during the celebration of Sukkot, when they had the Simchat Beit HaShoeva, where people gathered in Jerusalem and they had a wonderful, joyous celebration, Hillel would say, Im ani kan, hakol kan. If I am here, then everything is here. Now, what kind of statement is that by a person who, the Talmud says, is second in humility only to Moses? The Torah says about Moses, he was the most humble person on earth, meaning in past generations and until the end of time, there will never be anybody who is as humble as Moses. And Hillel is second to him, and Hillel says, right, if I am here, then all is here. Right? Now, this is out of keeping with Hillel's style. So we have to understand what Hillel meant by that. We know that selfishness is not appropriate, and yet the Torah says, "Ve'ahavta l're'acha kamocha," love your neighbor as much as yourself. That is assuming that one has self-love, right? But isn't self-love inappropriate? So what do we do with that? So what happens is that we're ending up with a bunch of conflicting statements that we have to try and resolve, although my ancestor was not able to resolve the two. Maybe since then there have been many sages who have shed some light on the subject, and maybe we'll be able to resolve a little bit about how can one have a self-awareness and a feeling of self-worth, and at the same time be totally self-effaced as the Torah requires. So with that, Bruce can take over.
It's more Abbott and Costello than I thought.
Oh, thank you for having me, and I just wanted to also thank Karen and the other people who spoke during the dinner about Steve and his life. Not just to hear about him, but just the heartfulness was really very intense, and I'm still sort of feeling that. And so I'm sure it's going to shape some of what I say. My experience in the Buddhist community is that as a group we tend to be more in our heads, and I know from some people who have practiced Buddhism who are also Jewish, that's been a conflict. Even my sister, we're not Jewish, but that took her out of Buddhism actually because there just wasn't enough heart energy. So I don't think that's anything that's resolved. It's something I really appreciate about being here tonight. I looked up the quote by Hillel, and see, that's what we're going to be talking about. And I didn't hear the questions as actually inviting an answer as much as the possibility of engaging with the questions to step into a state of being a question ourselves. And I think that any words we use, any thoughts we use, basically are tools. We could call them paradigms or just positions we take, practices of directing our attention to certain parts of our experience. And to me, there's a very accurate sequence in the three statements that if I think it's, if not, I am not for myself, who will be? If I am not for others, what will I be? And if not now, when? From a therapy point of view, I think it's very necessary for most of us to have an inquiry into what does that actually mean to be for myself. I don't think it's answerable, but I think it's necessary to sort of wrestle with that. I don't think it's possible to just be for oneself. It's just, it's impossible. Just as it's impossible to only be for others. But I think the inquiry points us towards certain work that has to happen if we think of our life as a path, which is my training. In most spiritual traditions, it seems, in many cultures, many different places on the planet, it seems that most of us need to have some sense of being of worth to ourselves, being able to function in the world, to play our roles, whatever we choose them to be, or wherever we find ourselves, with some sense of dignity and open-heartedness. If we jump over that work into trying to be of benefit to others, usually there are some very predictable problems. Trungpa Rinpoche used to refer to that as idiot compassion, where people would try to be nice people, but they hadn't worked with their own rage. They hadn't worked with their own confusion, their own hidden grief. So if we have not made a commitment to our own pain, I think it's extremely unlikely that we can really be compassionate to other people in their pain. I think it's more likely we'll end up above them somehow. Maybe not in an obvious way, but in a patronizing way somehow, that you're in pain and I'm somehow not, so let me help you. But if we've really gone into the truth of what a mess we are ourselves, then we end up being able to relate to other people with the very experiential conviction, we're all in this together, we're all a big mess, you know, and our commitment to our own pain actually becomes our motivation to be compassionate to others, I think. But I think in terms of a developmental sequence, that usually has to happen first. The next piece of work seems to be to not take that to an extreme and enter some fantasy of alienation, where we think our life is, as Rabbi Twersky was saying earlier tonight, is just about comfort, because we end up then just insulating ourselves from the truth of life, from the truth of other people's pain and grief. So if we want to escape that fantasy of alienation, at some point we have to sort of reverse the logic of the exact things we had been practicing before, which is to learn to take such good care of ourselves that we have no resentment building up in our interaction with others, that we learn to keep our heart open because we're taking such good care of ourselves. But the next piece of work is to go beyond that and start to dissolve the tendency to try to hang on to our well-being and to insulate ourselves actually from the world, which becomes a little tempting when we've done such a good job with our own state of mind that we can actually stay in a relatively good state of mind. But it is necessary to go beyond that. From a Vajrayana point of view, which is the sort of the manifestation of Buddhism as it went into Tibet especially, we don't want to also stop there of just trying to be a benefit to others, because that can still be a formula of a certain type. And if we understand that we can't really take refuge in taking care of ourselves, but we also can't really take refuge in trying to take care of everybody else, we're left actually with an unresolvable sort of stance in our life, which can throw us experientially into the immediacy of our experience. And that's considered, among other ways of talking about it, the skillful means of Vajrayana is the practice of immediacy. And the deeper we go into the immediacy of our own experience, we find there's no ground to stand on at all. There's no reliable sense of self, there's no reliable guideline in terms of our culture. We can use them as guidelines, but we can't actually take refuge in any of those things. So we're left arising every moment and having to trust our engagement with our life. Not that we're not going to make mistakes, it's just that there isn't actually a choice. We have to be committed to the truth of our own experience without exception. And that means committed to our pain and our confusion and our grief and our sadistic impulses and the whole business. And it turns out that our experience is actually the only support we have in our life. So if we really want to have a ground from which to try to be of benefit to others, we have to have a commitment to presence, to immediacy, to embodiment, to open-heartedness, and then just see what happens. So to me, these lines are actually sort of pointing out, in my trainings, are pointing out a path. They're not pointing out answers. And each of us will have a different experience walking that path.
Bruce and I have a certain, certainly have a commonality in that we're both involved in doing therapy and trying to help others. I think that for the purpose of clarity, I think it would help if we try and clarify the term self, because it gets all confused. Is it good to be selfish? Is it bad to be selfish? What do you mean by selfish? And maybe use the term of self as being the good kind of self, and the ego as being the bad kind of self. Okay? So though, at least for the conversation tonight, when we talk about self, yeah, what is the self? And as I said earlier tonight, is this the self? Right? Is this the self? This is an animal body. Right? If this is the self, I'm in trouble. Right? The self then is something other than the physical body. Now, this has enormous implications. The Rabbi Zalman and Tanya says, look, we believe that the person's neshama, the person's soul, is an emanation from God Himself, and that every person's soul is divine in nature. But God is absolute unity, right? Therefore, He's indivisible. Therefore, if my neshama is part of God, and your neshama is part of God, and your neshama is part of God, and your neshama is God, all our neshamas, all our souls are one. Right? So we are actually, all humanity is actually one being. Yeah, but we're not one, because I'm here, and you're here, and you're there, and you're there, and we're separate. Yeah, we're separate because our physical boundaries are separate, right? My being ends here, your being ends here, your being ends there. Which means that if we focus on nurturing, primarily on nurturing the body, right, we are focusing on that which separates us. If we focus on nurturing the soul, right, then we are emphasizing that which brings us together. Okay? And so if we begin to think of selfishness as myself is really my spirit, myself is really the soul, and therefore I want to nurture that soul, that's fine. That's a good kind of selfishness. Right? I'm going to free associate, okay? That's the only remnant that was left over from my psychoanalytic thinking. But I allow myself to free associate. Because as I said before, sometimes I get ideas from things that come up right before we go on stage. And this is when Rabbi Goldfeder led us in singing Oda Hashem B'chol Levav. Right? I will thank God with all of my heart. Those who are familiar with Hebrew, it should have said Oda Hashem B'chol Lev. I will thank God with all heart, not Levav. Levav is almost a plural. And the Talmud says, when the Torah says that you should serve God with all your hearts, and use this expression, Levavchem, that it means with both hearts. What do you mean both hearts? Because each individual has within oneself, right, a heart which is inspired to spirituality, and a heart which is inspired to physicality. There's no great trick in serving God with spirituality in terms of the devotion of the neshama. It's no big trick to say, I will serve God with fasting on Yom Kippur. What is much more important is to be able to eat a tasty roast, right, a filet mignon, and enjoy it, and that should be a spiritual experience. Now, someone said that our father, our nation, was Abraham, Abraham, and his contribution was bringing monotheism into the world. That's not quite right. There were monotheists long before Abraham. Noah was a monotheist. There were many monotheists. So what was the contribution of Abraham? The contribution of Abraham was that one can serve God not only with the neshama, not only with the spirit, but also with physicality. Physicality too can be made holy. Now, I'll tell you why I think that this is important. And this is because, we're therapists. I see a lot of people, and I'm sure Bruce does also, who are discontented, they're unhappy. True?
How I make my living, right?
It's how I make my living. See people who are unhappy. Not everyone who is unhappy is depressed. Now, the word depressed is a descriptive word, it's an adjective. Yeah, I don't feel happy, so I'm depressed. But then we go into clinical work, and there is such a thing as a depression. And that means much more than the person is unhappy. Because many depressions are due to some sort of neurohormonal upset in the system, and those are correctable by antidepressant medications. On the other hand, if you take a person who comes in who's unhappy and is not clinically depressed, you can give him every antidepressant in the world. That's not going to make a bit of difference, because that's not his problem. Now, this occurred to me, this little bit of insight occurred to me as a result of an experience that I had when I was working for the state hospital, and I was assigned a chronic building in which there were several hundred patients. Some of them had been there 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. They'd been warehoused there and forgotten. And I wanted to know who my patients are, who is this, who is that. So I said to the nurse, you know what, every morning and every afternoon, bring me in 10 charts. I want to read the chart, I want to read the medical record, and then I want to see the patient, so I'll be able to associate the name with the person. In those days I had a memory, I could have done it. And then I got one chart, and I looked at the chart, and this was a woman who's 58 years old who had been in the state hospital for over 3 years. Why? Because she had a refractory depression. Her depression did not respond to treatment. Went over her records. She had been hospitalized twice in community hospitals, had various treatments, had electroshock, did not get better. She has a refractory depression. She might as well go to the state hospital for the duration. I said, okay, now have her come in. Patient walked in the door and I said, oh my gosh, she doesn't have a thyroid. It was obvious from one look at her that she was thyroid deficient. And then I went back and looked over at the records. In both of the hospitalizations that she had had in the community, no one had done a thyroid test. Okay? And therefore, no matter what treatment you gave her, couldn't work because she was deficient in a substance, and she's not going to get better until that substance is provided. Now, what's this got to do with the price of beans? I think that if we nurture our body appropriately, we have a healthy body, right? If we are deficient in iron, we're going to have iron deficiency syndrome, iron deficiency anemia. If we're deficient in vitamin C, we're going to have vitamin C deficiency, vitamin D deficiency. We know what those deficiencies are medically. We know how to diagnose them. We know how to treat them. How do you treat them? By providing the missing substance, right? And if somebody has an iron deficiency anemia, they're going to get well only in one way, if you give them iron, right? You can give every vitamin in the world, and it will not affect them. They will not feel better if you don't provide the missing substance, okay? Now, being that we are bodies, but we are not only bodies, but we are bodies with a spirit, and call the spirit whatever you want, my interpretation or anyone else's. The spirit needs nutrition just as the body does. And if you don't give the spirit its nutrition, you're going to develop a spirituality deficiency condition. which is not going to get better until the person gets spirituality. You want to say religious spirituality? Okay. You want to say spirituality that is separate from religion? Okay. Whichever way you have it. You're going to have religion. Now, what happens, though, is there is a leading symptom, a prominent symptom of spirituality deficiency, and that is discontent and unhappiness. A chronic discontent and unhappiness. The person is unhappy with life. The problem is that nobody thinks that it may be because of spirituality deficiency. Right? Nobody even occurs to me. When I went to psychiatry, I was taught that you got to find out how did he grow up and how did he relate to his father and how did he relate to his mother and what were the environmental things. But nobody says, hey, maybe the person is deficient. And if there is such a thing as spirituality deficiency, then you can treat him with everything, with medication as well as psychotherapy. He's not going to get better. You have to address the spirituality deficiency. The problem is that when people feel distress, they look for relief. That's only normal. So what does a person do if he feels unhappy? Looks for some way to escape that unhappiness. One guy finds it in alcohol, the other guy finds it in drugs, the third guy finds it in sex, the fourth guy finds it in making money, the other guy finds it in gambling, the other guy finds it in workaholism, right? And all of them are using escapes and never have a true relief of their syndrome because they're missing spirituality. So my point is that I will be coming at it from one aspect, other therapists may be coming at it for another aspect, but ultimately we're going to the same place. Right? We're going to the same place that the individual is more than an animal. He's more than an intellectual baboon, which is what Homo sapiens means. Right? And he is a creature, a person with an integral part of himself, which is a spirit. Right? And that has to be nurtured. And if we don't do that, psychotherapeutically, no matter what else we do for the patient, right, we may give him more escapes, but we're not going to change the basic condition.
We're talking about psychotherapy, but we're also talking about Judaism and Buddhism. And I'm curious as to how this plays out both in therapy and in Buddhism. Is there a difference in the way you look at it?
Not to speak for Buddhism, but out of my training. I think that most of us understand when we talk about there being a deficiency. In Buddhism, there's three major schools historically. The jargon is Hinayana, Mahayana, Vajrayana. Hinayana is basically about personal liberation, and the view is that you are going to practice for many lifetimes or something. And it still has a strong deficit sort of quality to it. You're trying to achieve something in the future. Mahayana came several hundred years later, and it was a critique of this sort of goal of personal liberation, and instead said, it doesn't really matter how much we've attained as long as we're protecting ourselves from the suffering in the rest of the world. So we need to give up our goals of personal liberation and dedicate our life to the liberation of all sentient beings. And that was actually considered to be a faster path. So the goal was liberation of everyone. In Vajrayana, the view is that everything is already liberated. From that point of view, the main obstacle is ignorance. In Hinayana, the main obstacle is considered passion or attachment, Mahayana anger. In Vajrayana Buddhist practice, it's seen as ignorance. From that point of view, there is no deficit. The feeling of deficit is very real, and we have to work with people given their experience, of course. But the view that the therapist might have, that I have actually in my work, is that people are fundamentally pretending to be confused. So I lose some people, you know, who take their dramas very seriously. But from my point of view, there isn't anything missing, there isn't any deficit, but there definitely is, as Rabbi Goldfelder was saying at the beginning, a sense that we are hiding from our own basic nature. We're hiding from our own spiritual nature. And different traditions have different explanations from that. It could be a really bad joke, it could be just play, entertainment, it could be just a mystery. I don't know myself. But it does seem to me that as a therapist, what has felt most accurate and most useful comes out of my Buddhist training, which is that my energetic intention is to address that wakeful part of the person I'm working with. The language I use has to be their language often, not just mine. But I personally don't work from an attitude that that person is deficit in any way. And of course, we all need different paths, so some people that works with and others it doesn't. But I do feel like there's a possible collusion that as a therapist I can enter into with people I work with if I think that they're missing something. You know, something has to be healed or fixed or supplied that's not there. So I prefer to work from the point of view that if they want to sort of pretend on a certain level that they aren't in touch with their own fundamental nature of open awareness, that's okay. Why should I be aggressive and tell them otherwise? But I don't think it would be a kindness to pretend that they're missing anything. So that might be one way to talk about that.
Rabbi Twersky, it seems to me that the Hillel quote also has to do with some tension between the individual and community. And in Judaism, community is very important. Is part of the spiritual deficit you talk about, how would you relate that to the sense of community, of being?
Well, the concept of community in Judaism is very clear. For example, there's many things that, in terms of our services, that we cannot do without a community. Right? There are certain prayers that cannot be said without a minyan, without a quorum of 10 men. If a marriage has to take place and two people are going to be fused together, they're going to be fused only within the community. There has to be a minyan. So the concept of community is very strong. It's also very interesting that the Talmud says that a prayer of a community is not turned away. And therefore it is important that, yes, a person can say the prayers in the confines of his own residence, but it's better that he go to the synagogue and pray together with others. But then the question is, see, we've been doing that for thousands of years, and I've been doing that almost every day, and yet those prayers don't seem to be answered. And I came across an explanation which I think is true, and that is, community prayer does not mean that there are a number of people in the same building praying. Because if there's 50 people in the same building praying and everyone is praying for his own needs, that's not a community prayer. A community prayer is when there are 50 number of people in the same building, right, and they are all praying for the same thing. Which means going beyond the self, not only for myself, right, but I'm praying for the welfare of the community. So community is certainly a major part in Judaism. I do have to reflect something that Bruce brought up, which I think is fascinating, because I heard when Bruce said that there are people who come to him who don't know that they are confused, right? And the reaction was, what do you mean they don't know they're confused? But I think you can look at that several ways. And that there's such a thing as the fact is that you're not confused. It's just that you don't know that you're not confused. Right? And if I go back upon some of the things that I think were valid points that psychoanalysis has made, is the concept of repression, meaning that there are some emotions, ideas, whatever, that I have, right? And I have them, they're very real, but because I am very uncomfortable with them, right, my mind has repressed them, and so they're hidden from me. Right? So I really know what I am, and I really know what I want. It's just that I don't want to know what I know, right? Because it'll stand in the way of my animal body, you know. So I think that there is such a thing as not knowing. You're really not confused. And if you really knew everything about yourself and had a true self-awareness, you wouldn't be confused. The thing is that you're fooling yourself and you're thinking you're confused. I think it's absolutely legitimate. I'm glad you brought that up because it's become very clear. I just want to say one other word, and we're going to run out of time. This is my free association. We're talking about the need for self. It was really crystallized for me when a young woman who came to me, she made a bad marriage, and we knew it was going to be a bad marriage, but she didn't want to hear of it. And several years later, she came, her husband had abandoned her, she had several children, and she was totally exhausted, totally spent out, and she said, I give every bit of myself to my children, but then what do they have? Right? And what she's saying was, sure, I give myself to my children, but I'm a nothing. Right? And so when I give myself to my children, they're still not getting anything. Which means that in order to be able to give of yourself to someone else, right, you have to feel some sort of sense of self-worth. Right? And this is why should be very, very humble. No, the world was created for me. Right? You have to be able to have a self-worth if you're going to be able to contribute to someone else.
I would also like to know more in the Buddhist tradition, the sense of community and other as opposed to the self and how that plays out.
I think that's certainly, as I've experienced it, I think in a lot of ways it's not the strong point of Buddhist practice. That if you look at Buddhism historically, it was a response to a Hindu culture, and it basically was about leaving home, even your family, leaving your culture. And Buddhist practice was mostly spread through teachers leaving or students coming between countries, and it was often the elite, the educated people who were most interested. It had very sophisticated sort of views that were being discussed. And so historically, Buddhism didn't spread by community. It spread by ideas and practice. And in many of the countries in which it spread, it actually became the state religion at one point or another. And as such, of course, it manifested in the whole range of culture in that country. So it wasn't, it didn't have the same sense of continuity of community, or as my impression of Judaism is that it was mostly spread through emigration, and that it was the Jewish communities were almost always in a rather hostile, larger culture, and there was a lot of pressure there to keep community as the vehicle of that spiritual view and practice. Whereas in Buddhism, it was sort of easily exported without much sense of specific culture attached to it. It's one of the reasons it spread into a lot of different cultures. So I think that's something that is going to be a challenge to Buddhism in America, certainly, is where's the community? Where's the sense of commitment over time? We had a strong sense of community with Trungpa Rinpoche, but that was, very common when you have a very charismatic leader. And after his death, the community didn't seem to have the same strength as more traditional communities. So it's an open question, I think.
We're going to be taking questions from the audience, so if you do have a question, there is a microphone, and I would ask that you go to the microphone. And while people are getting ready to ask a question, did you, Rabbi Twersky, did you want to respond to?
Rabbi Twersky.
Okay.
At the dinner, you spoke about the younger generation and the feeling of having fun, and the goal of life was pleasure. And when you talked about a spiritual deficiency, I wonder if it's something like much of the inability to handle the dark, the shadow, the trouble in difficult times. It's, many of my friends turn away from that and deny it and won't go there. They won't listen to anything that brings them closer to understanding a deeper level that might include some very difficult things to look at. That to me seems to be what I would call a spiritual deficiency.
There are parts of us in which we would experience some discomfort. We refer to the dark and the shadows, whatever. And that because of that discomfort, and being that we're in a culture that doesn't want to know of discomfort, right, they try to escape it in one way or another. And the most easiest way is to have access to some sort of chemical that will anesthetize them. Right? Which means that they would have to find out that there is a expectation of life, and I'm repeating myself, that is not simply comfort seeking. In the famous Jewish ethical book, The Path of the Just, Mesilat Yesharim, he begins by saying that God put man into a world that is full of challenges, and that life is one big series of challenges, and a struggle that one must overcome. So, yeah, I think that people who see this aspect of life, and it is uncomfortable and it does create a challenge, may try to escape from it in one way or another.
Don't you feel that there is some pleasure in helping others, in overcoming obstacles, in going through transitions? Is there not pleasure in that as well?
Of course, but it's a good kind of pleasure. Right? And don't forget, there's nothing wrong with pleasure. It's when pleasure becomes totally egocentric, and to satisfy my own pleasure, I really don't care whom else I affect, as long as I gratify myself. But certainly helping others is a very legitimate form of pleasure. I just wish that people would be more indulgent in that kind of pleasure.
Evie.
So if you suspect your friend has a spiritual defect, defect? No.
Deficiency.
Deficiency. That, I knew that was saying the wrong word. How do you help your friend go towards spirituality?
Religion is not the area of the therapist. Stay away from it. And I can understand that. But if religion is not the area of the therapist, spirituality is, because I believe spirituality is a vital ingredient of a person's health. From a holistic point of view, it's not only physical, he has to have another component. And I feel it's my duty to tell the patient, have you looked at all into your spiritual life? And when they tell me, oh yes, I go to synagogue every Shabbat, I said, that's not what I asked you. Huh? I'm asking you, how much are you doing about your spirituality? And I said, look, I don't have to tell you what your spirituality should be, but I want you to start thinking about spirituality in the terms that I've described, and see if you are using your unique human abilities and trying to develop them to the fullest. Right? And that's what you ought to do. Right? So.
Is that similar to what your approach is, or?
As a therapist, yes, I definitely. But I was just reading something the other day that really struck me, and somebody discussing how to help somebody, and they were saying, why don't you start with just considering the attitude of saying to that person, I'm sorry, I love you, forgive me. And I could feel part of me just said, you know, I don't want to consider that. You know, I want to help them, you know. But as soon as I let that in, that was so powerful to just address that part of us that wants to find unresolvable grief and disturbance in others. And as professional helpers, of course, that's a very good setup. So I think that one of the most powerful things we can do is to start as if we are the problem, actually, not that person we want to help.
Possible, but could you contrast the concept of compassionate presence in Buddhism and Judaism in terms of this immediacy of presence that are both Torah and Buddhist practice?
One of my teachers said that compassion fundamentally is seeing things as they actually are. So from that point of view, compassionate presence is sort of a stark honesty along with a very open heart. And it's not especially trying to fix anything, but it's dissolving the fantasy, let's say, of separation between ourselves and others, so that we're not, it's very easy to get into some type of therapeutic aggression or maybe spiritual aggression toward others if we don't come from our own vulnerability. So to me, that sort of compassionate presence has to be rooted in the fact that we don't know. And that's what we find in immediacy. We don't know. We're just rising fresh every second. And we are winging it, as far as I can tell.
Thank you.
My free association is to a story that I remember reading about one of the great rabbis of Chabad, who had people coming in with various problems, one after another, and abruptly he told his aide, his shamas, to close the door. I can't afford to see anybody more. And after a period of 2 hours, he told the aide, you can let people come in again. And later on he explained, when somebody comes to me with a problem, the first thing that I've got to realize is, where do I have that problem? And only then can I help him. He says, well, generally when people come in with problems, I was able to find where I have that problem. This last person who came in, I couldn't find where I had that problem. And so I didn't feel I could be of help, and I said, there's something wrong if I can't identify and feel that I have that problem too. So for 2 hours, I prayed, I said Tehillim, I said Psalms, until I was able to come to the point where, yes, now I can find that within myself. So I think that it's, many roads lead to the same destination. And yeah, you have to find the problem within yourself in order to be able to be helped on others.
Rabbi Zalman?
We have a mission in Judaism of Tikkun Olam, which is to repair the world. And I was very curious with what Bruce had to say about the person really being whole and trying to discover that wholeness. And if in Buddhism there's also that concept of the world that, it seems totally opposite of what Judaism believes, that we have a world to repair. From a Buddhist standpoint, would it be that the world also is in a state of wholeness and that somehow we need to reveal that?
The way I understand that is that there are different practices appropriate for different circumstances and at different stages of one's path. So that if somebody is starving, if their kids are dying of disease, if there's political oppression, things like that, I don't think it's kind actually to have a discussion about the insubstantial nature of all phenomenal experience with them. I think it's probably more kind to get them food and clean water and so forth. So if we're addressing the level of experience where things are, where there's injustice and where there's trauma and where there's horrible things happening, the appropriate response is to try to improve those situations at a more subtle level of experiencing, which probably is mostly for individuals at this point in our evolution. It's probably not especially a sort of a, that kind as a sort of a social dialogue, but at least for individuals who happen to be drawn to that type of work, I think it's helpful not to continue the idea of postponing a complete acceptance of reality until something has been repaired or improved or healed. Instead, to accept everything as it is without any qualification, and we might find that in that acceptance is a feeling of wholeness. It's not really about the outside world. But if we find work that has to be done, I think we should do it. Does that make any sense to you?
Rabbi Zalman.
Same question, but with a different flavor maybe. Because there is an understanding that the condition in which we are dukkha, it's a bad condition. Nobody is not suffering in Buddhism. And if I look at the issue of galut, exile in which we are, so the issue of people being in discontent with the situation as it is, isn't necessarily pathology. I think it may be just a goad to make things better socially and to come together stronger. So I'm just wondering what your response would be to that.
Appropriate response in many ways rather than a problem.
Yeah, you see, I don't see, I'm glad you worded it that way, I don't see discontent as a pathology. It's when we begin to see it as a pathology, then we have to go in and cure and fix. And I don't think that, from what I'm talking about, that the discontent of spirituality is something that we have to go in and fix. It's simply making the person aware that there's an integral part of herself or himself which they haven't addressed. Now, I don't know if that answers the question or not.
Bruce?
Well, I don't know of anybody who would make efforts to wake up without feeling a state of profound discontent. And it's the same discontent as Rabbi Twersky has been talking about that would lead to addictions. I don't think it's a different feeling or an experience of deep, sort of an accurate intuition that things are off somehow. We're all drawn to different ways of working with that, but I would say that discontent is, on a relative level, a completely accurate experience that provides the motivation for most of, why would anybody be here tonight? From a Buddhist point of view, at some point though, we might find that what we thought we were discontented with was not really an accurate perception. That there's actually nothing to be discontented with if we are not being fundamentally aggressive toward the truth of our experiencing.
Or as Woody Allen said, life is full of pain, loneliness, and suffering, and it's all over much too quickly. And it's all over much too quickly. David?
And I need to, there's a little preamble to the question itself. I'm not sure in Buddhism if there is a concept of God, but I think that there's some sort of universal truth or spirit or some sort of universality that connects us all. So perhaps we can substitute that concept for the words when I say God to allow answers from those. For drugs comes from a disconnection of oneself from God or from the universal spirit. And I had also been taught that the Baal Shem Tov, that his father on his deathbed had given the Baal Shem Tov the instructions to always picture God before you. And in my own life, I find that in my own spiritual practice, it's very difficult. I can pray, but praying I don't think is necessarily a strong connection with God, one that's strong enough to break through depression and break through unhappiness and pain. But there are occasional moments where I'll have a strong connection and where there's a tremendous bliss in that connection, and it does dispel depression, it does dispel pain in life. It's more wonderful than any intoxicant I've ever experienced. Unfortunately, those experiences are few. So my question is, how do we become more like the Baal Shem Tov? How do we have these experiences more often, where we're able to be ourselves, where we have, we're individuals, and yet we're also able to be connected to godliness or to the universal whole?
I wish I knew how to be more like the Baal Shem Tov, you know? Again, I'm trying to free associate to the idea of having moments of inspiration and feeling a closeness to God, right? And with whatever comes with that feeling, if you're really talking about a feeling of closeness to God, that's also a feeling of of oneness with the whole world, right? Because the Hasidic philosophy is, when we say "Ein od milvado," there is nothing other than God, does not mean there are no other gods. It means there is nothing in the world except God. It's not to say that everything is a hallucination and delusion, but we have to understand that everything is godly. So to see God before me always should not be really difficult if we really set our minds to it and we can see God in everything. However, there are moments when a person has a feeling of inspiration, and it's a wonderful feeling, but then it's lost. And there's a story with the Baal Shem Tov that I think can shed a little bit of light on that. One of the Baal Shem Tov's disciples complained to him exactly what you said. There are moments when I do feel I'm getting closer to God, but then it dissipates and I'm as far away as ever. And this was very frustrating to him. And the Baal Shem Tov said, well, that shouldn't be frustrating to you at all, because that's the way things should be. And he said, why? So the Baal Shem Tov said, imagine this scene. A father has a child, and he wants to teach the child how to walk. Now, the child has been walking on all fours, ambulating on all fours, which is, pretty safe. And now the child has learned to stand up without holding on to things. But he's afraid to take the first step because he might fall. He's not on all fours. So what does the father do? As soon as the child can stand upright by himself, the father places himself very close to the child, holds his hands out about 3 inches from him and says, come on, come on, come on, come on. Well, the child sees that the father is so close to him that if he were to fall, the father will catch him. So he has the courage to take that first step. So what does the father do when the child takes the first step?
Steps back.
Okay, come on, come on. Well, I didn't follow the first step. I guess that's pretty, so his father's still close enough, so he takes 2 steps. So what does the father do? Good, good, come on, come on, come on. And as the child keeps on walking and making more effort to walk, the father retreats. He says, if you put yourself in the child's mind, the child is trying to figure out what in the world's going on here. I'm making efforts to reach my father. The harder I try, the farther he goes away. Right? He says the child's goal and the father's goal are disparate. Right? They're totally different. The child wants to reach the father. There's no problem. The father could pick him up. Right? The father wants the child to learn how to walk, how to ambulate. And the moment he allows him to reach him, the lesson of progress is over. He says, you want to get close to God? That's wonderful. That's not what God wants. God wants you to learn how to look for Him. Right? And as soon as you come close to God, you know what God's going to do? He's going to retreat, so you have to walk a little more. So I think when we realize, if I've had a moment of inspiration, okay, I got close. But then it goes away. I guess God wants me to try and look for him harder, right? So we renew our efforts. Right? And it can be, if we understand this, it doesn't have to be frustrating, right? Because we constantly pursue and grow in spirituality as we continue to work toward reaching God. Because it's the journey, and here we may agree, that not that we really disagree, you know, but that here we may agree that it is not the goal, but it's the journey, and that the journey is the goal.
Had a way of addressing that perhaps, which I like, which is that freedom is not a state of mind, but it's an attitude we take toward all states of mind. So I think we could also say sacredness is not a state of mind, but it's an attitude we take toward all states of mind. And so if, I personally don't care if we say God or universal spirit or whatever, the problem to me is when we actually invest in the appearance of being a separate self without examining, inquiring so deeply that we find out there perhaps is actually no essential nature to that appearance of being a separate self. But as long as we think there's a separate self, then of course we're going to think that God or whatever is separate. But as you were saying, Adam Twersky, that if we understand that if God or whatever word we use is universal, that has to include everything. There are no exceptions. So can we commit to our depression? I mean, if it's a brain chemistry issue, we should use antidepressants or vitamin, sleep, exercise, whatever. But if it's an existential depression, can we commit to our experience of depression as being just as sacred as our experience of being close to God? Otherwise, we're really trying to sort of get one up on the universe. We're trying to pick and choose. And it's not an attitude of surrender, it's not an attitude of humility, it's not an attitude that's going to dissolve our fantasy of alienation. And it may be that it's the fantasy of alienation that's the fundamental root of our suffering, not how close we think we are to sort of a very nice experience, which is, of course, is transitory.
So it sounds like you're echoing what he said about the oneness with the whole world as sort of a definition of the experience of the divine, or is that in Buddhism
as long
also?
as we don't exclude anything. Yes.
Oneness with
I've been trying to contextualize these ideas into my experience. It has been difficult. And I found problematic what you say about pretending to be confused and like about the dramas, because I do believe there's a lot of communities and populations that live a lot of drama, and so I really want to bring that that you're talking, and I know that you're talking to a kind of class and a kind of race, and a kind of group, a specific group. Because I have met in Boulder, so I'm trying to bring this into our most direct experience. And in Boulder, lots of families, people they get very, very sick, and they don't go to the hospital. Obviously, they don't have health care, and they're very afraid of going outside their houses, and they're really sick. So I have two questions, and one is how to develop self-worth or self-love when these people are being criminalized, are being they have internalized so much about negative images about themselves. So how to develop that? And my second question / comment, I was an Arupa student and I struggle a lot I made it, I graduated. But I found that when I really like made my social commitment and I really talk about others' pain and be with them, I could touch my own pain, because I heard about, like starting with yourself, then move on to the other.
So-
and what I found is many people stay there in the self. Oh, I'll do that later. So that's, like also bring that other way of seeing that.
Good
So I think
question.
that-
As I said before, some people, the kindest thing to do is to help them get to the hospital and to try to have some sort of social activity to get decent health care. That's the kindest thing to do for many people. But for some people who have, let's say, more fortunate life circumstances, they have those more favorable life circumstances in place, and their work might be, in a very fortunate way, more subtle. For them, as was said earlier, you could imagine, as far as the pretending thing, the issue of repression. It's a good, very classic issue that you could ask yourself, well, how could I repress an aspect of myself if I were not aware of it? We have to be aware of it to repress it. But part of our work, unconsciously, is to not have conscious participation in that awareness. So awareness is not synonymous with conscious awareness. There's awareness always going on. As far as developing kindness, my training would suggest that the practice of being as immediate as possible in staying in the embodied truth of our experience and bringing kindness to everything that arises is right at the heart of developing personal kindness. But the other side, which is not focused on so much as in Buddhism, is to, as soon as possible, not wait, is to be kind to others, to keep our heart open, to be of service to others. Otherwise, we start actually being indulgent, and that's not the point.
There's a great quote about a man was asked, how do you develop self-esteem? He says, well, first you go out and do some esteemable things, and then you think about having done them. Yehudis, we have time for a few more questions. We're going to move along as our evening comes to a close. Yehudis and Grace. And
I don't know if it has to do with tonight, but I think a lot of the theme, for me personally, and I'm sure many people here, a question that comes up with me is, so many of us are in helping or teaching or leading or guiding professions, and how do we empathize with other people's pain and at the same time give a kind of guidance that helps people to be inspired and move from the pain rather than them staying stuck with the pain, and us as teachers and leaders and helpers not being overwhelmed by that pain.
One of our great uncles, the Rebbe of Talmud, I spoke about this with someone tonight, who was receiving petitions from his Hasidim, from his adherents, all morning. And then his aide, his shamus, said to him, "You're soaked with perspiration. Why are you sweating? You weren't doing any physical exertion." He says, "I wasn't doing any physical exertion?" He says, when somebody comes to me with a problem, I have to be able to feel that person's pain. I have to be able to feel that person's distress. So what I have to do is I have to take off my own clothes and put on his clothes so that I can feel what he's feeling. But then I can't help him at all because I'm no longer objective. I'm in the same situation that he is. So I have to take off his clothes and I put my own clothes back on. He says, "Do you realize that I've been sitting here all morning taking off my clothes, putting on his clothes, and you say that I haven't been exerting myself?" I think that's the best example. We have to be able to empathize and identify, but we also have to be able to detach. If you don't empathize, you can't do any good. if you don't know how to detach, you can't do any good. So you have to be able to do both. And I think that's probably one of the greatest teachings in becoming a good psychotherapist, is how to be able to identify and then detach.
In the past 30 years, there's been a lot of research and work done with physical illness and the relationship and connection between. So, a question came up when you were talking, and I'm wondering if a spiritual deficiency is really possible, or if it's an illusion, or I know an emotional wound is, I think an emotional wound is possible, that's part of, perhaps maybe part of mental illness, but is a spiritual deficiency really possible, or is it just something that we think we're experiencing or think needs to be filled up or fixed or dealt with?
I don't have a lot of experience working with sort of somaticized issues that way, so maybe Rabbi Twersky would have more. As I said before, I don't take the view that that it's fundamentally accurate that we're missing anything, but I do have the evidence is obvious that people have that experience. So we have to deal with a person's experience without, as Rabbi Twersky was saying, we have to have sort of an empathic resonance, which comes out of our own vulnerability, and at the same time we have to not be captured by that display. My personal bias is that Western therapy in general tends to be about improving the quality of one's life, whereas Buddhism tends to be about freeing oneself from this display, from being identified with it, not from participating in it, but being identified with it. So to me, both of those have their blind spots, and both of them are actually a very good complement with each other. But I would say that most people who talk about their wounds, I would say, from my side, I wouldn't perhaps talk with some of those people in this language, but the way I would see that is basically a refusal to be completely present with the truth of their experiencing, that they're still taking refuge behind this story that gives them a justification not to really be completely present with the truth of their life at that moment.
Did you want to respond, or?
Yeah, let me get the other part of the question. This one was dealt with very well. The other part of the question in terms of mind, body, spirit kind of thing, there's no question anymore. Even traditional conservative medicine has come across with the realization that not only psychosomatic diseases, but almost any condition can be helped or worsened by how the person feels. There are certain conditions that are almost totally brought on by emotional states. So in our work with patients who have both emotional disorders or physical disorders, you have to concentrate on the emotional thing for the person to. And if you notice in the Mishaberach that was said tonight, when we pray for a person's recovery, we pray for the refuat hanefesh and refuat haguf, healing of the spirit and healing of the body, right? And healing of the spirit even comes before healing of the body.
Because if I say, my name is Paul, and I'm an alcoholic, and then 10 years later, even though I haven't had a drink, I say, I'm Paul, and I'm an alcoholic. I'd just like you to speak to the question of identity, which speaks both about the self and about the community. And is there, how do you affect that change or transformation or that self-identity?
Well, I tell you, look, it's very important to remember that you're an alcoholic, because if you have truly the disease of alcoholism, then you become so vulnerable that even one drink or one chemical may throw you off and cause into a relapse. So that's why we have to say, yeah, my name is Paul and I'm an alcoholic. But that's not what's going to keep you sober for the rest of your life. What's going to keep you sober for the rest of your life is the realization that if I use a chemical, it's going to deteriorate me, and I have no right to be less than what I can be. So what I want you to say next time you get up to a meeting is, my name is Paul, I am a beautiful person who's an alcoholic. Right? I am a beautiful person who's a cross addict. The interesting thing is that I had a number of people sitting around the table, and I said, okay, now, each one of you identify yourself as you would at a meeting. And one woman said, my name is Helen, I'm an alcoholic. Another guy said, my name is Frank, I'm a cross addict. And they went around, and I said, okay, now I want you to do it my way. I want you to start saying, my name is Ethel, I'm a beautiful person who's an alcoholic. And we went around, and some of the people who had no problem in saying I'm an alcoholic and I'm an addict choked on the words of saying I'm a beautiful person. Right? So my feeling is that I'd like to start this little revolution in the 12-step program of people saying, identifying themselves and say, I am a beautiful person with the disease of alcoholism or addiction.
Would this beautiful person come up and ask the last question, please?
Something the Dalai Lama talked about, the importance of the differences, the different religions, how important it was that we had so many different religions because everyone's different and different people need different paths. But then he also said it was important, and I don't know that this is really a precise quote, that somehow we reach beyond our religious differences. And so when I think about self and community, there's also, you're a self in a community, but then the community is a self and has an identity in the world. And then there's these communities with these different identities of self as their community bumping into each other. And so we're a self within a community and a community within maybe a larger community. So I guess I want you to speak about what's the role of the community within humanity and how do we reach across our different communities, our different religions to, address the pain that's being experienced in these different communities.
Well, there's a difference between acknowledging that we are both separate and connected at the same time. There's a difference between that and thinking that there's something to resolve, like we're supposed to reach out or bridge the differences. And maybe that's not actually even possible. In therapy, one of the jargons is differentiation, which is where we are able to hold the truth of separateness and the truth of connection simultaneously with no resolution. In Buddhist Vajrayana thought, we hold the fundamental energies of separateness and connection, masculine and feminine, simultaneously, actually as the display of ecstasy, because there's not a resolution possible, actually. So it's possible that it has more to do with dissolving our fantasies of alienation than of making a connection that's somehow missing.
Speakers tonight, I just wanted to echo something that Rabbi Twersky said, that the prayer of a community is not turned away, and I know that tonight our prayers are with Steve Phillips, and want to thank all of you for being here and joining us at the annual Aish Kodesh fundraiser, and I feel blessed to be part of such a wonderful community. And I want to thank Rabbi Twersky for joining us and sharing his wisdom, and Tift for being here and sharing his wisdom. So thank you to our wonderful speakers, thank you to the wonderful cooks tonight, and to everyone in the community who made this evening possible. Thank you all for being here.
Before everyone leaves this evening,